The wind never stopped in the highlands of Wyoming. It whispered through the pines, sighed across the valleys, and moaned against the weather-worn walls of Jesse McGraw's cabin. For most men, the sound was maddening. For Jesse, it was just company, distant, unfeeling, and steady. Like him. 8 years had passed since Jesse had spoken to another human being. That fact didn't bother him. In truth, it had become part of his identity, as essential as his calloused hands, or the deep scar over his left eyebrow. It wasn't hiding, not exactly. Hiding suggested fear. Jesse wasn't afraid. It was done, before he vanished into the wilderness. Jesse McGraw had been a respected rancher just outside of Abilene, Texas. A hard worker, a good man. His hands bore the marks of decades on horseback, his back the quiet dignity of a man who built everything he owned with sweat. But what truly defined him back then wasn't his work. It was her, Rachel, his wife, freckled, wild-haired, and kind to a fault. She had the kind of laughter that made animals trust her and made Jesse feel like the world was still a good place. Their love wasn't grand or showy, but it was deep, a quiet, daily kind of love that settled into bones and built a future. That future ended in fire. It happened on a dry autumn night when the wind was sharp and the stars clear. Jesse had gone into town to deliver a few heads of cattle and pick up supplies. Rachel stayed behind at the ranch, 7 months pregnant, glowing and serene, insisting she was just fine. The lightning storm rolled in sudden and cruel. A bolt struck the barn, igniting the hay like tinder. By the time the neighbors saw the smoke and rushed to help, it was too late. Rachel had tried to save the horses. Jesse never forgave himself. Not for being gone. Not for coming back too late. Not for being alive when she and their unborn son were not. In the days after the funeral, people came, neighbors, preachers, friends, with casseroles and hollow words.
Oh.
They said things like God's will and time heals. Jesse nodded and thanked them, but inside, he was already gone. The night after the burial, he packed a satchel, saddled his mare, and rode north. He didn't say goodbye, didn't leave a note. What was there to say? He kept riding until Texas turned into Colorado, and then into the wind-cut valleys of Wyoming. He found an abandoned trapper's cabin near the edge of a pine forest, miles from the nearest trail, and claimed it as his own. There he began the life of a ghost, chopping wood, mending fences, fishing the streams, and watching the seasons roll over the mountains like time didn't matter. Jesse didn't speak aloud, not even to himself. At first it felt strange, like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit. But as the weeks bled into months, and the months into years, silence became comfort. In silence, there were no memories, no questions, no voices echoing the past. The cabin was simple but solid. A stone fireplace warmed a single room. Lined with old tin cups, worn books, and tools gave it a lived-in feel, even if no one but Jesse lived there. The walls bore no photographs. But there was a small box beneath the floorboards containing the only pieces of his past. A wedding band, a charred bit of baby blanket, and a photograph of Rachel smiling in front of the old ranch gate. He never opened the box. Every day followed a rhythm. Wake at dawn, feed the horse, cut firewood, check the trap lines, make coffee, fix whatever was broken, eat whatever was left. Watch the fire, sleep, repeat. Some winters were brutal, others were merely cruel. There were times when Jesse wondered if he would die in that cabin from cold, from age, or from some accident, but death didn't come. And Jesse, for all his sorrow, never invited it. He didn't want to die, just didn't care if he lived. But beneath the quiet and the grief, something deeper lingered. Stillness. Not peace. Jesse never claimed to be at peace, but a steady kind of stillness, like a pond that no longer ripples. His hands were still strong, his heart, while guarded, still beat. The world hadn't ended, even if his world had, and so he stayed, season after season. Watching the land shift, grow, and sleep, he knew the animals by sight. He knew when the deer would come down the ridge and when the bears would wake from their dens. He read the weather in the sky better than any farmer ever had. The land didn't ask questions, didn't demand grief be processed, just was. That was the life Jesse had chosen. Not to forget, he never could, but to endure. He figured he'd keep on enduring until the day his body gave out. And when that day came, he hoped it would be quiet, under the stars. With the wind still whispering through the trees, but fate, it seemed, had other plans. Because on a bitter November evening, as the wind howled louder than usual and the snow began to fall in sheets, Jesse heard something strange, something that didn't belong in his world. A sound. A thud, then silence again. Jesse stood slowly from the chair by. The hearth, the old creak of wood under his boots, the only noise inside the cabin. He grabbed his rifle from the wall and opened the front door. There, collapsed against his porch rail, was a woman. She was frozen, bloodied, and barely conscious. Her coat was torn, her face pale. Her eyes, when they flickered open, were full of fear. And just like that, Jesse McGraw's long silence ended. The woman collapsed on Jesse's porch looked like something the blizzard had torn loose from another world. Her coat was too thin for the Wyoming cold, more suited to town than mountain winter, and her boots were worn to the sole. Blood had seeped through the sleeve of her coat, soaking into the snow beneath her like ink on white parchment. Her cheeks were raw from windburn, and one side of her face was bruised a sickly purple. Snow clung to her hair, a tangled mess of chestnut brown. Jesse stood in the doorway, wind biting at his bare arms, rifle held in one hand. His heart thudded slowly but solidly. This moment felt unreal, like a dream, or perhaps the ghost of one. He hadn't spoken to anyone in 8 years. Now, someone had collapsed at his door. He moved before he had time to think, setting the rifle aside. Jesse crouched beside the woman. Her breathing was shallow, but steady. Her lips were cracked, whispering something he couldn't quite make out. Maybe a name, maybe a prayer. Carefully, he slid one arm beneath her shoulders and the other under her knees, lifting her as though she were no heavier than a bag of feed. She stirred slightly, a wince escaping her throat. Jesse cradled her against his chest and brought her inside. Nudging the door shut with his boot, the cabin, warm from the fire he'd tended all day, wrapped her in heat like a blanket. He laid her down gently on his cot and peeled off her coat. That's when he noticed the full extent of her injuries. Her left forearm was gashed, likely from a branch or a fall, and her hands were red and swollen with frostbite. A bruise bloomed across her ribs beneath a torn blouse. Jesse didn't speak. He hadn't used his voice in so long it almost felt foreign. Instead, he moved with silent precision, a man familiar with pain, even if not recently this kind. He fetched a clean flannel shirt from his drawer and covered her with it, then added blankets from the footlocker. Next came water from the kettle and a rag, which he used to clean her wounds. She flinched when the warm cloth touched her skin, but didn't wake. It was only after she was bandaged, warmed, and sleeping deeply that Jesse finally sat back, running, a hand through his beard. He didn't know her name, didn't know why she was here, but he knew one thing for certain. She hadn't gotten lost. She had come to him. The snowstorm raged all night. Jesse barely slept. He stayed in the chair near the fire, watching her chest rise and fall, steady and slow. Every now and then she'll murmured in her sleep, names, fragments, and once the word please. Her hands twitched as though fending off ghosts. At dawn, Jesse made coffee and stew. He did what he always did, fed the horse, split firewood, checked the traps, but his rhythm was thrown. His world had shifted. A stranger now lay beneath his roof, and the old life of silence no longer fit as easily. On the second morning, she woke. Her eyes fluttered open, confused and darting around the room. Jesse, who had just placed a bowl of warm broth near the fire, turned and met her gaze. She tried to sit up, groaned, and fell back into the cot. Her voice was raw, little more than a whisper. Where? ... Where am I? Jesse hesitated. Then, for the first time in years, he opened his mouth and said, in a voice rough with disuse. Safe. The word felt strange in his throat, like turning. Over earth that hadn't seen light in years? The woman blinked. She coughed. I didn't know if I'd make it. Just kept walking. Jesse handed her the bowl. Eat first, he said. Talk later. She took the bowl with shaking hands and drank slowly, eyes never leaving his. There was fear in her, but also something else. Caution, maybe, or the lingering embers of determination. I'm Clara, she said eventually. Clara Whitmore. Jesse nodded once. Jesse, thank you, she murmured. For not leaving me out there. He didn't answer. Instead, he returned to the hearth, added another log, and stirred the stew. Clara's voice was stronger when she spoke again. I didn't know where else to go. I saw the smoke from your chimney. I thought maybe I'd die in the woods if I didn't try. She didn't elaborate, and Jesse didn't push. He understood desperation. He'd lived inside it long enough to recognize its marks and the tightness around her eyes, the guarded, the way she spoke, the bruises she didn't yet explain for now. None of that mattered. What mattered was that she was alive that night. Jesse gave her the cot again and slept on a bedroll near the fire. She asked why. He simply replied, You're. The one hurt. In the stillness that followed, Clara whispered something he wasn't sure he heard right. You don't seem like a man who lets people in. Jesse stared into the fire. I don't, he said softly. But something in him, something he thought was long dead, stirred as he said it. The snow didn't let up for 5 more days. Jesse had lived through storms before, enough to read the sky and know when the land wasn't letting go. The drifts reached past the windows, and the world outside became a sea of white, smothering all trace of trail, tracks, or time. It was the kind of storm that erased roads and buried memories, or, you weren't careful, exposed them. Inside the cabin, the fire never stopped burning. Jesse rose before dawn to chop wood, making sure they had enough to outlast the cold. He worked silently, his breath fogging in the chill, and returned each morning with snow crusted in his beard. Clara always stirred when he came back, still weak but stronger with each passing day. By the 3rd morning, she was able to stand on her own, even if she held to the wall to do it. Your boots, she said quietly, noticing them drying by the hearth. They're worn. Jesse glanced down. They work. She smiled a little. So do mine, until they didn't. He didn't smile back, but he didn't frown either. For Jesse, that counted as warmth. Clara moved carefully that day, sitting near the window with a mug of broth cupped in both hands. She was wrapped in a flannel blanket, her hair pulled back into a rough braid. The bruises on her cheek were starting to yellow. The cut on her arm was healing well under his bandages. You live far out, she said after a long pause. I thought I'd find ... no one. You almost didn't, Jesse said. She looked over at him. Would you have left me out there? No, the answer was immediate. No hesitation. She nodded slowly, accepting it. Clara didn't tell her full story that day, or the next. But over the course of the week, in moments between silence, she offered fragments. Jesse didn't push. He listened, quietly, just as he did to the wind and the animals. And like the land, he waited for her to speak when she was ready. Was a ranch in Elkwood, she said one evening, stirring a pot of beans. About 40 acres. Nothing fancy, but it was ours. I was 20 when I married Jacob. He was a hard man, but not cruel. He worked sunrise, too dark, and never missed Sunday. Dinner. We didn't have much, but we had enough. She paused. Jesse didn't interrupt. We couldn't have children. It wore on him, made him colder, but I still loved him. I thought he just needed time. Then he died. Her voice dipped there, and she didn't look at Jesse. They said it was an accident. The barn roof collapsed during a storm. They found him under the timbers. Her hand tightened around the spoon. But something didn't feel right. Jesse leaned forward slightly, attentive. She didn't seem to notice. After Jacob died, his brother came. Vincent said Jacob owed him money. Lots of it. Claimed the land was collateral, but I never saw any documents. No lawyer. Just threats. Jesse's jaw flexed slightly. He'd known men like that, snakes wrapped in silk words. I refused to sell. He started coming around more. Drunk. Mean. First it was just shouting. Then it was worse. Clara looked down. You've seen the bruises. I left one night when he passed out. Didn't even take food. Just my coat and Jacob's old rifle. But I lost that crossing the creek. She didn't cry. She wasn't the crying type. Jesse could see that. She was the kind of woman who had cried long ago, till the tears stopped meaning anything. Jesse stirred the fire with a poker, watching the flames dance. You think he's following you? She nodded. If he finds me, he won't leave a second time. Said nothing, but something in his expression hardened, not with fear. But resolve. Clara looked at him then, studying him in a way she hadn't before. You're not just a hermit, are you? Jesse raised an eyebrow. You've seen trouble before, she said. I can tell. The way you move. How quiet you are. Like you're listening for something that might strike. He didn't deny it. Who did you lose? She asked. The question landed like a stone dropped in still water. Jesse didn't speak for a long time. When he did, the voice was soft and not quite steady. My wife and our son. He stared at the fire. A fire. I was in town. Got back too late. Clara didn't respond with sympathy. She didn't offer words like I'm sorry or that's awful. She just looked at him with a stillness that matched his own, a recognition only grief could create. They say pain fades, she whispered, but I think it just gets quieter. Jesse nodded once, or deeper. They sat together in silence. After that, the crackle of the fire, the only sound between them. In that quiet, Jesse realized something strange. Her presence didn't feel like an intrusion anymore. It felt like something else. Not comfort. Not yet, but maybe the beginning of it. The snow finally stopped. A week after Clara first appeared, the sky broke open to reveal blue again. That crisp, hard kind of blue that only comes after a storm has cleared its throat and moved on. But the wind still whispered through the trees, and the drifts piled around the cabin would take days to melt or dig through. Inside, the cabin was quieter now, though no longer silent. Clara moved more confidently each day. She washed dishes without being asked, fed Jesse's old sorrel mare, Daisy, and organized the shelves with the kind of practical grace only a ranch wife would know. She never overstepped. She kept to the edges of his space, asking before touching anything that looked like it might matter, even when it clearly hadn't been touched in years. He also noticed the way her eyes scanned the tree line whenever she stepped outside, always watching, always measuring the distance between herself and danger. They were two people who had learned how to survive, not thrive, not hope, not even rest, just survive. And for reasons Jesse couldn't quite explain, they were doing it now together. On the 10th morning, Jesse found Clara standing on the porch with a mug of coffee between her hands. Steam curled around her face, softening the shadows beneath her eyes. You always wake this early? She asked as he stepped. Outside beside her. Earlier, he said, usually. You always this quiet? He glanced at her. Usually. She gave him a sideways look, a wry smile teasing her lips. And here I thought I was the quiet one. They stood like that for a moment, both sipping their coffee, watching the sunrise stretch long fingers of light across the snow-covered field. The trees sparkled like glass. I used to hate silence, Clara said eventually. It's made me feel like I was waiting for something bad to happen. Jesse nodded slightly. Sometimes it means that, but not here, she added, almost to herself. A squirrel darted across the snow near the shed. Daisy snorted softly from the paddock. Jesse's dog, a gray-and-white shepherd mix named Boone, dozed by the cabin steps. This place, she said, feels like a pause. Jesse understood exactly what she meant. Cabin, his self-made exile, had once been a tomb, a place to forget the world, to bury the living part of himself. But now, with Clara here, something had shifted. Didn't feel dead anymore. Inside the cabin, the routine continued. They shared chores, cooked simple meals, tended fire and stock. But beneath the surface, something else began to settle, not comfort, not yet, but familiarity. Clara had a way of softening the hard edges of things. She hummed when she cooked, quietly, sometimes sad old folk songs Jessie hadn't heard since childhood. She cleaned without fuss. She stacked the woodpile with purpose. Even when her hands were still raw from frostbite, Jessie caught himself watching her sometimes, not out of suspicion, but wonder, how someone so clearly wounded could still function with such calm. She didn't break. One night, as they ate by lantern light, Clara finally asked the question that had been hanging in the air for days. "You ever plan to go back?" Jessie looked up from his bowl. "Back where you're from? Wherever you left?" He stirred his stew. "No. Why not?" Jessie shrugged. "Nothing left." She nodded slowly. "Same." For a moment, they sat in that agreement like two stones leaning against each other just enough to stay upright. Later that night, Clara sat in Jessie's old rocking chair by the fire, mending one of his flannel shirts. He watched her from his cot across the room, where he lay with a book he hadn't truly read in days. The light caught her hair in a way that made it shine like copper. "You always this careful with things?" he asked suddenly. She looked up. "Only the things that can't be easily replaced." That answer hung in the air longer than he expected. He set the book down. "You don't have to stay, you know. When the snow melts, you're free to go. Town's a half-day's ride once. The trail's clear." Clara didn't look surprised. "I know. You thinking about it?" She looked down at the shirt. Her needle paused. "Some days, and other days." She glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Other days, I wonder if I've already arrived somewhere I didn't know I needed." That quiet truth nestled between them like the warmth of the fire on their skin. Neither spoke again that night, but something changed. Not with grand words or gestures, but in the silence, a deeper kind of understanding bloomed. Small moments, quiet truths in the following days. Jessie began speaking more. Not much, not suddenly, but he asked questions now, about Clara's old life, about her garden, about the dogs she'd once raised with her late husband. And in turn, she asked about the land, the animals, the hills she could see from the ridge, but hadn't yet explored. They became two ghosts who slowly began to remember they had bodies. Clara caught Jessie once, staring at the only photo he kept, a scorched, crumpled picture of Rachel, tucked into the drawer beneath the tools. She didn't ask about her. She didn't need to. Clara knew what it was to live with grief as a second skin. But that night, as she cleaned the hearth, she whispered, "We never stop loving them. We just learn how to carry them differently." Jessie didn't respond, but he nodded. And in that nod, Clara saw more than any spoken word could offer. The snow was melting, and with each drip from the roof, each soft patch of ground that reappeared, beneath the white, Jessie McGrath, the man who had vanished, began, quietly, to return not to the world, but to himself. And Clara, the widow who had once fled through the snow, was becoming more than a shadow. They were still ghosts, but now they were haunting the same place, together. Spring came slowly in the mountains. The snow thinned day by day, revealing wet, dark soil beneath. Pine needles peeked through the ice near the cabin's edge, and runoff from the hills formed small streams along the trail. Birds returned first, flashes of blue and red in the trees, their songs breaking the long-held silence of winter. For the first time in years, Jessie heard himself humming as he shoveled snow from the porch inside. Clara was hanging dried herbs. Above the stove, her sleeves rolled up, cheeks flushed with heat and effort. She'd taken to reclaiming the cabin with quiet pride, reorganizing shelves, scrubbing the floors, even stitching new curtains from fabric Jessie didn't remember. Owning it didn't bother him. In truth, it felt right, like the place had been waiting for her all along. But peace, Jessie knew, was a thing you had to watch. Too much of it could dull a man's edge, and sure enough, the first sign came that afternoon. Jessie had ridden out to check the line traps. The snow near the creek had melted enough to reveal old coyote tracks, and the air smelled of thawing pine and river mud. Boone trotted alongside him, ears alert, tail stiff. That's when the dog froze, nose to the wind. Jesse slowed his mare. Then he saw it, a thin column of smoke rising beyond the next ridge. Not from lightning, not from a settler's cabin. Someone had built a fire where no one should have been. He dismounted, crouched low, and scanned the horizon. Through a pair of binoculars, he saw the outline of a single man, rider, tall, heavy-set, standing beside a black horse. The fire was small, deliberate, the kind made when you didn't want to be seen, unless you wanted to be seen. Jesse's. Blood ran cold. He returned to the cabin before dusk and said nothing right away. Clara was stirring stew by the hearth, her eyes soft with calm. He watched her for a long moment before finally speaking. Someone's out past the ridge. Stopped stirring. You sure? One man. Camped at the edge of timberline. Doesn't look like a trapper. Clara didn't answer. She set the spoon down gently. Could be a drifter, Jesse said. Could be someone passing through. But you don't believe that, she said flatly. He shook his head. No. Clara sat down slowly, folding her hands in her lap. He found me. Could be, Jesse said. No, she said more firmly. It's him or someone working for him. Jesse didn't need to ask who him was. Vincent. Jacob Whitmore's brother, the one Clara said, had claimed her. Husband's land and beat her until she fled into the wilderness with nothing but a coat and a locket. Jesse had half hoped the man wouldn't bother tracking her. Wyoming was far, cold, and ruthless. But some men didn't care about distance when their pride was involved. Or controlled. Clara stood and walked to the window. Shoulders were tight. If it's Vincent, he won't ask nicely. He never does. Jesse looked at her. You scared? Yes, she admitted, but not of dying. He tilted his head. Then what? She turned to face him, of being dragged back, going back to a world where I'm nothing but a man's property, where I don't get to choose what I do, where I go, who I become. Jesse studied her, then said something he hadn't said since the night she arrived. He's not taking you. How do you know? Because I said so. The next morning, Jesse pulled an old wooden chest from beneath the floorboards. Inside were pieces of a life he'd buried 8 years earlier, his father's Colt .45. Wrapped in oiled cloth, along with a saddle holster, spare rounds, and a worn leather belt. He cleaned the gun slowly, methodically, like a ritual. Clara stood behind him, arms folded. You were a gunman once? No, he said, but I wasn't always a recluse either. He handed her the old Winchester rifle he kept behind the door. You still remember what I taught you? Clara nodded. She took the rifle without hesitation and checked the chamber like it was second nature. By noon, Jesse had scouted the ridge again. The stranger's camp was still there, but empty. Fire cold. No tracks led downhill toward them. He returned quickly, saddles cinched tight, blood sharp with purpose. At the cabin, Clara stood waiting in her long coat, locket visible beneath her. Scarf, rifle in hand, Jesse rode out toward the trail, heart steady, eyes forward. He wasn't a violent man by nature. He hadn't raised a gun in years. But there were moments when a man had to remember what he once was, not for revenge, but for justice, and to protect something that still mattered. As evening fell, Jesse spotted the man again, riding alone down the narrow trail, black horse kicking up slush. He wore a long coat, the kind meant to hide weapons, and his face was familiar even after all these years, square jaw, smug mouth, the eyes of a man who'd never heard no without making someone pay for it. Vincent Whitmore. He pulled up. When he saw Jesse, clearly surprised, didn't expect company this far out, you lost? Jesse asked, voice calm. Vincent grinned, teeth white against a weathered face. Nope. Looking for someone? My sister-in-law ran off. Family business. You seen her? Jesse stared at him. She's not yours to claim. She's my brother's widow. That land belongs to my family. She belongs on it. No, Jesse said. She belongs wherever she's safe. That's here now. Vincent leaned forward in the saddle. You plan to stop me, cowboy? The voice was quiet, but the steel in it was unmistakable. I have to. Trouble had found its way north, but Jesse McGrath, a man the world thought broken, had found something worth defending. And Clara Whitmore, a widow who had once run through the snow with nothing but fear, no longer stood alone. The storm had passed. Now came the reckoning. The night was heavy with silence, not peaceful but taut. Like a bowstring pulled tight, Jesse sat on the porch sharpening his knife. Not because he expected to use it, but because old habits had a way of calming the nerves. The firelight from inside flickered through the window, casting his shadow long against the snow-covered ground. Clara was inside, cleaning the rifle and checking the door locks for the third time. Neither of them spoke much that evening. There was no need. Everything important had already been said. Vincent had ridden off before dark, but Jesse knew he'd be back. Men like that didn't back down, not because of principle, but because of pride. Especially when they thought they were owed something. Jesse had seen his type a dozen times over in his youth, always trying to bend the world to their will, always thinking they had the right to other people's lives, but this time, the world wouldn't bend. Jesse wouldn't let it. When Jesse stepped back inside, Clara was sitting near the fire, the rifle across her lap. She looked calm, though her jaw was set in that stubborn way Jesse had come to recognize. "You sleep," he said. "I'll keep first watch." Clara shook her head. "Won't sleep anyway." They sat together for a while, saying nothing. The fire crackled. The wind outside had gone still, like even the woods were holding their breath. Clara finally broke. The silence. "If something happens, it won't. But if it does," Jesse cut her off gently. "He doesn't get you. Not now, not ever." Clara looked into the flames. "Thank you." Jesse's voice was low. "You saved me too, Clara, just not with a rifle." Dawn, the first light came with a hush. The sky turned a bruised purple, fading to gold near the tree line. The ground shimmered with frost, and every twig snap echoed like thunder. Jesse stepped outside, rifle in hand. He wore his duster, boots laced tight, the old revolver holstered at his hip. Boone stood beside him, ears perked. He didn't have to wait long. Two riders appeared over the ridge, Vincent, as expected, and a second man, tall, rough-looking, the kind Jesse recognized as a hired gun. Not skilled enough to ride alone, not brave enough to stand for anything. Vincent slowed his horse at the edge of the clearing. He looked at the cabin, at Jesse, then spat into the snow. "This ain't your fight," Vincent called out. "She's my responsibility. I came to take her back peacefully." Jesse stepped off the porch. "That so? A funny way of being peaceful, riding up with a hired hand and a shotgun." Vincent grinned. "Insurance, you understand? She's not going anywhere with you? That's not your call?" Jesse's hand hovered near his revolver, but he didn't draw. "Not yet. She's got a name. She's got her own will, and she's free. You try to take that from her, you answer to me." "You don't scare me. Old man, you think hiding in the hills makes you tough? I've burned men better than you off their land." "You ain't burning anything today," Jesse said flatly, "and I ain't hiding. I'm living." The second man nudged his horse forward, but Jesse's hand finally dropped to his side, just enough to rest on the revolver grip. A subtle warning, the kind men paid attention to. "Tell your man to leave," Jesse said. "He doesn't need to die for your pride." The gun hand hesitated, then looked at Vincent. "He ain't wrong, boss. Maybe we come back another." Vincent snapped. "Shut up. You got paid to ride, now ride." That was his mistake. In the time it took Vincent to bark the order, Jesse moved. His revolver came up like lightning, smooth, practiced, silent. One shot rang out and knocked the pistol clean from Vincent's hand, sending it spinning into the snow. The second rider froze, hands raised, suddenly very aware that he was out of his depth. Boone growled low. Vincent clutched his wrist, cursing the skin torn from the grazing bullet. "You son of a... You come back again?" Jesse said, voice as cold as the mountain air. "And I won't aim for the gun." Clara stepped out onto the porch then, rifle across her chest, eyes locked on Vincent. "He means it." Vincent looked at her, something in his expression cracking, not anger, recognition. For the first time, he saw the woman who had once flinched in his presence, now standing tall. Unafraid, backed by a man who had already lost everything and wasn't about to lose again. Go home, Clara said. What you're looking for isn't here anymore. Vincent's mouth opened to speak, then closed. He backed away slowly, mounting his horse with his wounded hand cradled tight to his side. He didn't look back. The second man followed wordlessly, disappearing into the trees like smoke fading on wind. Aftermath. Jesse stood in the clearing for a while, watching the trail, making sure. When he finally turned, Clara was still on the porch, her hands steady on the rifle. You all right? He asked. She nodded, but her voice was hoarse. Yes, just. I didn't think it would end like that. Most things don't, Jesse said. But sometimes they end just enough. He stepped up beside her and gently took the rifle from her arms. She let go slowly, exhaling for what felt like the first time in days. Inside, they sat together, the fire warming the small space that now felt like a home, not a shelter, not a tomb, but a place where two people had made a stand. Jesse looked at her. You're free now, Clara. What do you want to do with it? She smiled, tired but sure. Live. And for the first time in years, Jesse realized he wanted the same thing. The snow melted faster after the confrontation. It was as if, with Vincent's departure, something in the land itself began to ease. The sun lingered longer each day, and the icy streams roared louder, swelling with runoff from the thawing ridges. The silence that remained was no longer tight with tension, but calm, the kind of silence that asked you to breathe. Not brace, but peace, Jesse knew, wasn't something you earned in a single standoff. It was something you built day by quiet day, and now that building had to begin. Clara hadn't spoken much in the days after Vincent left. She kept to her routines, sweeping, cooking, tending to Boone, checking on Daisy, but her eyes stayed. Distant, she wasn't afraid anymore. That was gone. But something lingered in her expression Jesse recognized all too well: guilt. One evening, as twilight settled soft and blue over the hills, Jesse found her sitting by the creek behind the cabin. Her boots were tucked beneath her, and her hands rested in her lap. She didn't turn when she heard him approach. I thought it'd feel different, she said softly. Him leaving, it's finally being free. Jesse sat beside her on the cold rock. It doesn't. It feels like a door slammed shut behind me, she whispered. And now I'm standing in a room I don't recognize. I don't even know who I am in it. Jesse nodded slowly. He understood. After Rachel died, he said, I rode for 7 days without stopping. Thought if I got far enough, I'd feel something other than hollow. But the land doesn't give you peace just for running. You have to meet it halfway. Clara turned to him, eyes filled with quiet ache. How long did it take before you stopped blaming yourself? Jesse looked at the stream, the way it caught the light like broken glass. I'll let you know when I do. That earned the smallest smile from her, sad but real. At least you're honest. He gave a short nod. It's all I've got left most days. They sat there a while, just listening to the water eventually. Clara pulled something from her coat pocket, a small silver locket worn smooth by time and thumbprints. She opened it slowly, revealing 2 tiny photographs. One was her younger, smiling shyly. The other was Jacob, her late husband, tall, serious, mustached, and holding a hound pup in his arms. I used to think I owed him a better widow than I became, she said. That if I just stayed, endured what came after, I'd be honoring him. Jesse looked at her. You don't know the dead you're suffering. Clara nodded slowly. I know that now. I just don't know what I do owe them. He considered that. Maybe to live. Really live. She looked back at the locket. He was a good man, but he's not the man I need to become whole again. Jesse said nothing, but his eyes softened. He understood what she wasn't saying, that she was ready to close one chapter, not out of betrayal, but out of survival. She closed the locket and tucked it away. Do you ever go back to the place you buried them? I haven't been back to Texas since the funeral, Jesse said quietly. Never saw the point. The land still scorched. The house is gone. Clara hesitated, but it's not about the land? He raised a brow. Then what? She looked at him, voice low. Maybe it's about letting the ghosts see you're still here, that you didn't stay in that fire with them. The words hit deeper than Jesse expected. For 8 years. He hadn't let himself consider that idea, that surviving didn't mean betrayal, that continuing to feel didn't mean forgetting, that love in its truest form might want you to. He didn't answer her right away. Later that evening, Jasa opened the floorboard where he kept the old tin box. He hadn't touched it since Clara arrived. Inside were only 3 things. Rachel's wedding band, a scorched corner of a baby blanket, and a photograph nearly faded to white, Rachel smiling under a wide Texas sky. Belly full with the sun Jesse never got to hold. He sat at the table, the photo in his hand, heart a strange mix of weight and clarity, he whispered to the photograph, not even realizing he'd spoken aloud. I'm still here. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel guilt saying it. The next morning, Clara found Jesse saddling his horse just after sunrise. You going somewhere? She asked. He nodded. Town supplies. She looked uncertain. You haven't? Ridden into town in 8 years, he said, tightening the cinch. Clara stepped closer. Are you sure? I think it's time, he said. And besides, we're going to need more than beans if we're going to make this place a real home. Clara blinked. Jesse turned and met her eyes. If you still want to stay, she didn't hesitate. I do. He smiled, faint but real. Then it's time we stop living like ghosts. She stepped up beside him. You want company? Glanced at the second saddle, thought you'd never ask. That morning they rode down the mountain trail together, not as fugitives, not as ghosts, but as 2 people who had lost nearly everything and decided to try anyway, and maybe that was what healing really looked like. Not forgetting, but choosing to keep riding forward. Together.